Welcome to the Bogart Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following Bogart Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Today I've got Leah Dwyer with me, and we're going to be talking about what to do if you are forced to or unexpectedly have to retire. And thank you, Leah, for joining. This is a topic that is near and dear to me. Yeah, we've been doing planning now for, really, I've been doing it for the last 17 years. Bogart Wealth's been doing it for 8 years now. But the reality of it is that this is something that we see more and more and more. So, Leah, why don't we just dive in? Talk about how does this happen? What are some of the things that cause this? And then ultimately, I want to get into what should we be doing about it?
Yes, good morning. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to say this is a topic that I'm passionate about. I have seen it affect people in my life, friends, family members. I've seen it affect people in my husband's life. This is also something that, people that I can relate to that have had a coworker that was important to them, and that coworker needed to leave due to unexpected reasons, and it ends up affecting their career as well, because in the workplace, if you have someone that you're working with that you enjoy and you have a good flow and you're a well-oiled machine, and then those people leave, it can really affect the trajectory of your own career. So really, this is a topic that affects us all in many ways. Traditionally, financial advisors love to talk about the good old-fashioned emergency savings account, which is great for short-term problems. They also like to talk about retirement planning, which is something that we're all concerned about. Yes, everyone would love to retire at some point. However, the big issue with this retiring early or being forced into retirement is simply the fact that you find yourself in a situation where you intended to retire at age 60 or at age 65. If someone says, when do you want to retire? You have an age in mind. However, something could come in and interrupt that. And now you're forced to maybe let's shave 5 years or 7 years of income off of your current profession, and you're basically forced to leave. This could become a huge financial problem for many people.
Well, and truthfully, it's not just income, it's savings, right? So everything to me that you just said kind of boils down to financial literacy. And right. I believe that society is what I would describe as very financially illiterate. And what I mean by that is that this is not something that's prioritized well enough. And similar to you, I've experienced the same thing, honestly, even personally with some of the changes that have happened with the business, with my family. I mean, frankly, my mom just told me that she's retiring on my birthday. As an example, like, okay, are we going to run a plan?
Well, congratulations. Now what do we do?
Yeah, exactly. So the point that I'm making is we've seen this happen so many times. And honestly, I think the pandemic changed a lot. It changed a lot for a lot of people. I think it changed mindset. I think obviously it changed the whole work from home dynamics. And honestly, I think it changed the workforce at a greater length. But I also think that it changed people's desire to work, right? So I think we have a human capital crisis going on right now. And what I mean by that is there's more baby boomers that are retiring and leaving the workforce than there are Gen Zs coming in. But why that's so important is we're noticing with the millennials and the Gen Zs, their plan is to work longer, right? Like they want to work less now, but to work longer. And again, it's easy to say that right now while you're in, say, for example, you're in your 30s. But fast forward till you get to your 50s and like, all right, I'm done. But, because of that, if you didn't adequately plan or save while you were early on, well, then of course that might make that probability or possibility not available to you. And then throw in a scenario where you have to stop working, whether it be medical, you have skills that are not transferable to another job. Like, let's say, for example, you're a mechanic, and then all of a sudden you physically are not able to bend over anymore to do, repair work, just as an example, right? Well, That means that you're being essentially forced to retire in that scenario. And then we start looking at the demographics of let's just use the U.S. We've got 336 million Americans. It's crazy to me that 4.8 million Americans have $1 million saved for their retirement, investable assets. And less than 1.8 million Americans have 5 million saved for investable assets. And frankly, when we look at this inflationary environment, it's expensive, right? And so to me, all of this conversation comes back to this financial literacy topic, right? And I think, frankly, is one where the financial planners in us have our perspective, but I would also say that this is one where time is essential, right? And what I mean by that is getting with a planner and building out a plan as early as you possibly can is paramount. And so, we're going to talk a little bit about, where we should be saving and how we should be saving. But I think if there's any takeaway from any of our listeners who watch this podcast is have a plan and start working that plan as early as possible. I mean, right out of college, start building a plan, right? And understanding the plan is going to be dynamic in nature and it is absolutely going to change. I think any person in life that I've met that is successful, they've been resilient in some form or fashion. But if you look at that level of resiliency, it's their ability to build a plan, have a plan, and then work that plan, right? And I think that really is kind of the key essence of this conversation and taking away. So why, I want to kind of get back to script, if you will, a little bit. But when we talk about an emergency fund, Leah, what is an emergency fund and why is that so important?
An emergency fund covers you for a random expense that pops up. You need a new roof on your house. One of your kids is injured and there's a large medical bill. Something that pops up that is, outside of the scope of your normal everyday living expenses. An emergency savings account can cover that. Another problem that should arise would be there are many households now that have two incomes, which is unique to our time in history. If you look throughout history, there were several situations where there's only one income in the family. But now that most of us have two, if you lose one income, you lose your job or your spouse loses your job, can you cover your living expenses for 3 to 6 months? If the answer is no, you're taking a big risk. So that's why we typically recommend 3 to 6 months of expenses in a savings account. That gives you time to go and job interview and look at other opportunities. Maybe you don't want to be forced into taking a position that isn't the right fit for you. That could have a domino effect on your mental health just as much as your finances, right? So we want to make sure that you can make the choices necessary to move forward in your life. And that's why that emergency savings account is so important.
I agree with everything you just said. And I do think that society is, it's a generalized statement, but I think society is very much a consumption-driven society, the proverbial keeping up with the Joneses. Most Americans spend more than they actually make, which is why we see credit card balances continuing to rise. And part of that dynamic and impetus that I'm trying to really help with articulating today is that we need to rewire the way we think. And especially when someone's younger and they might have young children or they're trying to get launched in their career, those are the most difficult times to be able to do any type of savings, let alone build an emergency fund. You got to do a prioritization of goals exercise. And this really, again, I think comes back to building out the plan that we're kind of, let's just say not so softly alluding to. But the reality of it is that someone has to have an emergency fund. And there's so many different things that could happen. But I personally kind of reframe it a little bit differently in the sense of by having that plan that we're working, we're going to have clarity and visibility of what your short-term goals are. Then we'll understand, kind of the segmentation of the next iteration of goals, and then really our long-term goals. And so at long-term, especially for someone that's fresh out of college or transitioning into their 30s, retirement's a long-term goal, right? And that's one that to me still should be at the forefront and epicenter of these conversations. I'm biased, But the reality of it is that's one that we need to establish that mindset as early as possible and then just have it on autopilot. Like, don't even think about it. But immediately thereafter, number 2 is this emergency fund. And the reality is stuff happens. We can never predict the stuff. It's like, nowadays it's so expensive to replace an air conditioner, and so it's like an air conditioner goes, all right, well, there was whatever the number is, 10 grand, 15 grand that I wasn't expecting to come out. Well, that's a real number. And if we don't have that in a cash account, well, odds are we're putting it on a credit card and now we're paying, 30% interest or whatever it is to be able to finance that type of purchase, when that's not a good solution either, but it's a need, right? So the point is it comes back to this conversation around having a plan. Now, I do think when we define that emergency fund, it does differ a little bit. And this is where I might counter some of what you just said, because you had mentioned 3 to 6 months of income. But I do think that it really depends upon the stability of income in that household. And what I mean by that is let's say, for example, you have one spouse that has a very consistent job, they make a salary. Okay, that's very, very, very stable. There's not a whole lot of amplitude associated with their income. But on the flip side, let's say we have somebody who's in a sales role that their income fluctuates dramatically. Right? You could have one great month and then 11 really bad ones. And, ultimately they might make the same as what they made the year before, but they had 11 bad months. So the reason I say it that way is simply because anyone I believe that's in a sales role or has high variability of income, those are the types of individuals where instead of 3 to 6 months worth of emergency fund, we might need to look at what's appropriate for that household, because we might need that emergency fund to be a little bit higher dependent upon that. Because again, sales roles, you want to talk about the most transient job role out there is a salesperson, right? Look at a realtor, look at anyone that's in any type of medical sales, et cetera. They're moving jobs all the time. And the reality of it is that they have tremendous amount of variation in their income. And because of that, they need to be ultimately having a little bit more in that short-term emergency fund type of bucket. Now, not to get on my high horse, but I think it is important, coming back to the financial plan. We then run the risk too, potentially though, of over saving in an emergency fund. And we're seeing a lot of this right now with interest rates being so high, where people are just saying, you know what, I'm getting 5+% on money markets. Let's just leave it all in cash. Well, on a risk-adjusted and an inflation-adjusted rate of return, that's actually still not a very good return. It's a stable return, don't get me wrong. I do think that we're going to see money market rates coming down in the future. But again, coming back to having a plan, I think it's important to understand where someone's expenses are, because what happens is if we have the next 3, 6, maybe 12 months, depending upon job role, in a safe and low-risk environment, well, anything more than that, now we're being relatively inefficient with the money, unless we're starting to save for something that's more important to them. And it, frankly, it directly coincides with this discussion of unexpected retirement, unexpected job loss. Because let's say, for example, you're in the process of saving for a new home, or your kid's college, or you want to buy a second home. Well, all of a sudden you lose your job, and that's going to obviously reframe or reshift how we're needing to think about some of these goals that you have. And of course, means that we need to revisit the financial plan. Personally, I like to lean in those environments because those are some of the most formative, in the sense that when someone doesn't have an income, all of a sudden you learn how to live, let's just say, more frugally, and the standard of living does drop a little bit associated with that. And so now you can look at, all right, if I only have one income for a period of time, how do we make it work, right? And then all of a sudden you get into the job back up and things starts ramping back up. Well, frankly, maybe we do a little catch up on the savings. We don't elevate the standard of living. I'll admit, my wife and I went through this when we launched Bogart Wealth, right? It was a full reset, didn't have any income for 15 months. And we were forced to learn how to live very, very frugally for a period of time because there was no income coming in. Now, I will admit, income started coming back in and we've played a little catch up on the other side. But the reality of it is that it gives you that foundational element of being able to understand how to save, prioritize saving, and then obviously watching the expense side of things. All right. I know I'm talking at length, Leah. What is the solution really that we should be doing, if retirement does come unexpectedly? And let's get into a little bit more of the details associated with that.
Yeah, definitely. So in some cases, what I've seen is a scenario where you're going along just fine, your career is on the upward path, and then there's a company change or management change or the industry has changed and you just can't work like this anymore. So there's really a few different examples that I have of solutions. So one would be just a simple career change. You leave your company or you leave your profession and you get a job, right, doing something else. This could be a solution for many people. I've read in many articles that certain people have found that they had three different careers throughout their life, not just one industry or one type of position. Maybe every 10 years they switch. So that can be a good thing. However, that can be very difficult. That could come with a significant pay cut. So if you need to change careers and you have to do that significant salary reduction to your family, as you just stated, your family went through it, and you have to find a way to reduce expenses as well. And
Can I pull on that thread a little bit too? Because when I think somebody, we see this a lot with mid-careers, let's just say early to mid-40s, maybe even later 40s, right, where they now have the desire to change. I think it's really, really important as you're doing the assessment to look at all-in expenses, and all-in compensation, because it does include the benefits as well. And what I mean by that is there's now significant costs for healthcare. And so, yes, if you decide to make a change and you might not be eligible for healthcare within a new program, you could use something like COBRA. But I do think that there's also really, really, really significant value in retirement medical benefits as well. Like, for example, we work with one of the energy companies that they allow for medical benefits for the retirees at age 55 as long as they've been there for more than 15 years. That's one example of many companies. But let's say, for example, somebody leaves at 45, right? Well, that means automatically, let's say somebody joins them at 45. Let's use that as the example. Well, that means automatically if that person wants to get the retiree medical benefits, they're working until 60, right? Because they need that 15 years of time frame with that company. Now, automatically that has an impact. So, or on the flip side, let's say somebody left that company at 45. They need to then look at what is the retiree medical benefits associated with the new company that they're starting with, because that's going to have an impact. And I'll use this as just one of those little, rabbit holes, if you will. But if that person or that household's goal is to retire at 55, but now because of the cost of medical benefits, we might need to either budget for that 5-year gap, right, that they otherwise would have had. And frankly, that gap might have been 10 years now because we need to get them to Medicare. And that's just another one of the expenses that come into associated with making these types of decisions.
I love that point because it illustrates that you may have to work even longer, not shorter. The joining at 45 and then needing to work at 60, where potentially your original number was 55. If I said, how old, what's the age for you? How old should you be when you retire? If you said 55, but now, as you stated, you have to wait until 60 because of the medical benefits.
Yep.
So really that's kind of going the other way with it. So what I've been talking about this entire time was shaving 5 years off of your career, or now maybe you're adding 5 years to your career, which could take a toll on your health for sure if you weren't planning on it, right? So actually, I appreciate you bringing that up. A couple of other issues that could arise, or solutions rather, that could arise out of leaving your profession early would be starting a business. I've talked to several engineers at this point that found themselves in a position where they really didn't like the way that management had them handling things. So their other option, now that they're more of an expert in their field, they decide to go out on their own and start a consulting business or something of that nature, or maybe even start a business that has absolutely nothing to do with the profession that they've been working in for 20 years. Well, guess what that requires? A startup capital. So now we're back to the money situation. Now we are back to a situation where I need assets. If I have only saved in a retirement account and I'm 50 years old or 52 years old and I need to start a business, maybe you cannot pull from your 401k. So now we need to make sure that we have a plan in place and we've been investing across different account types. So an account in an account that is a non-retirement account, and that would be potentially where you would get your startup capital for to start your business. A couple other scenarios, the semi-retirement. For years, I didn't understand this term. I didn't know what it meant. Now I understand that a semi-retirement is where maybe you retire and then you go back as a contractor, or you retire and you obtain a similar position at another company that has, maybe the benefits aren't competitive or something of that nature. So now you're covering all of your living expenses, which is great, but now you're treading water in the sense that you are no longer saving for retirement. So now your original plan was to save and save and save until age 60. Well, now you've reduced your savings timeline by 5 years. So that may be a big deal depending on how good you were at saving in your 30s and in your 40s. However, what if during your 30s and 40s you had a spending problem, expenses were too high, you didn't focus on it, you were waiting until your 50s to save for retirement. However, now you've realized it's too late and you've just shaved 5 years off of your timeline because you're doing this semi-retirement treading water effect, which, as I stated, depending on what your financial plan was from the beginning, that may or may not be a problem for your family.
I love the way you frame that, because semi-retirement means that you have an income. And so, I talk about the accumulation phase of life, which is everything you're talking about, where save. And then we transition to the deaccumulation phase, where now all of a sudden we're needing our assets to be able to provide an income stream for us. In the semi-retirement scenario, you might have income that's either fully replacing your expense profile or partially replacing it, which is then ultimately more of that gradual transition into retirement, so the portfolio can continue to grow and save and get bigger. This is one of these podcasts where we could hit a lot of different demographics, and frankly, this could easily be a conversation where mom and dad push it to their kids, where the kids can take a lot of let's just say nuggets off of this. I personally love the ability to have the conversation around the value of time, value of money. When someone gets to the place where the decision's made and ultimately they can't make a change because, frankly, they're already 60 years old and they're ready and they're physically not able to do it. Well, I would love to send the message for let's just say mom and dad to the kids, where there's so much value in time, value of money. And just to quantify this, right? Like, if someone maxes out their Roth IRA starting at the age of 21 and they just put that $7,000 a year in all the way until they get to the age of 60. So then they're able to have about 1.67 million saved in a Roth tax-free. Just the decision to wait 10 years, so they start doing it at 31 now, drops that number to about 900,000. And I'm just using an 8% rate of return. But the point is that there is so much value by waiting 10 years to actually get that money in there, growing, compounding. We call it time value of money. But this is one where the earlier we can get those saving conduits in place, it becomes so much more, let's just say, less detrimental when the bad stuff happens, right? Because we've got those buffers and those buckets ready to go and available. And this is why I'll come back to financial literacy. It's at the epicenter of this discussion. I do think that having a plan is paramount. And so I want to talk a little bit, Leah, about how Bogart Wealth does planning for our clients. And the reason I say that is because I found, especially during the pandemic, we had so many people who came to us because these things were happening, whether it be the culture of their company had gotten so negative and they wanted to leave, or their companies all of a sudden had redundancy programs that pushed them out. And to me, I found it so fascinating that we've got individuals that are retirement eligible, 55, 60, even into the 60s, that had never even looked at this. I think it's one of these conversations that any financial advisor that's helping build out a plan for you, they need to be stress testing these plans. And what I mean by that is we need to look at the scenario that is going to be, call it the apocalyptic one. What is the worst case that we can do with these plans? And for a lot of the households that we work with, it's the earliest eligible, right? So age 55 and has 15 years of service. That really should be the apocalyptic one, right? Like, that's the one where you're getting termed and all of a sudden, you don't have enough duration or timeline to be able to do anything else. And we need to be planning for that. Anything else you want to add, with regard to the planning process itself and how it could help someone prepare for this?
Absolutely, yes. I would say if you're meeting with a financial advisor regularly, they are probably already working on a financial plan for you. You already have a financial plan in place. However, it's important
I
to
would
talk
hope.
about. I would hope so as well. Yes, that's the assumption, right?
Yeah.
But I would say talk to your financial advisor about a plan B. What happens when plan A doesn't fit real life scenarios? I'm saving for retirement. I'm, somewhat responsible, or I'm conservative in my spending, whatever the case might be. You also need to talk about coming up with a financial backup plan, if you will, and have them run those scenarios. There's also a tax question in there. Should I save more into my 401k? Or maybe could I still stay in a certain tax bracket and shift some of those savings to a brokerage account? Let's not try. Everybody loves to talk about diversification across investment types, stocks, bonds, you name it, right? Tech, whatever. However, I feel it is important to talk about different account types. I have my retirement account over here. My employer puts money into that. I put money into that. That's great and wonderful. We love that. Everyone wants to retire. But let's talk about how much money should I put into a non-retirement account, and how do I get that, rate of return that I'm looking for? As you stated, right now, everybody's getting 5%, right? So even if you're not comfortable with risk and you want to be able to get those funds back, you can do a money market. You can do different investments that are a little bit lower risk. Talk about that with your financial advisor, come up with your plan, and then come up with your backup plan. And they can run different scenarios. We can do a base plan. We can do an alternate scenario so that you see what this will look like in 10 years if you go this direction or that direction.
Well, and truthfully, I love everything you just said. And I think it's really, really to emphasize that a plan is not something that should be done once, right? A plan is an organic and essentially living document that is constantly evolving, because frankly, each and every one of us, our lives are constantly evolving, whether it be you have another kid or you have another grandkid or medical issues. And frankly, being more financially literate is the most important part of this process. And the sooner you can do that, the more empowered you're going to be if and when something were ultimately to happen. Leah, thank you for the time today. This was such a productive conversation. And if there's any questions, you need anything, please feel free to reach out to us at Bogart Wealth. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The previous podcast was intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that the future performance of any specific investment, strategy, or service will be profitable, suitable, or successful. Bogart is not a law firm or accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. There is no guarantee a client will experience a certain level of results if Bogart is engaged. Our brochure describing services and fees can be found at www.bogartwealth.com.